Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 328 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory, and joining me today is Claire Ratcliffe, an experienced MBA CP and UKCP accredited registered psychotherapist, supervisor and couples therapist. Claire's qualifications are too numerous to list, but include specialist training in assessing and treating sexual issues in psychotherapy. Today, she's here to share insights into a lecture she has created for the Counsellor CPD Library on the developmental model of couples therapy. The approach offers a fresh and dynamic way to understand relationship struggles, focusing on how couples evolve and how we, as therapists, can support growth at every stage. Whether you're already working with couples or considering expanding your practice, this conversation promises to be insightful and practical. So with that, I'll hand you over to Ken.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 328 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, where Rory Oakes and myself, Ken Kelly, will be walking you through three topics on counselling and psychotherapy, starting off with the ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're going to be delving into professional letter writing by counsellors when we need to write a letter to a fellow professional. Then we're going into practice matters, where we have the interview that has already been introduced by Rory, and that is with Claire Ratcliffe, and that's relationship therapy using the developmental model. And then we recognize you, students, in student services, where today we're going to be speaking about choosing the modality of therapy which is the best fit for you. But starting us off, I think a really, really important topic as professionals, which is what we are when we graduate as counsellors, psychotherapists, we are at times going to be called upon to write letters for different reasons, Rory, and there's some things to consider when doing this.
Yes, there is, and I think I'm going to start this off from a little bit of a different perspective, Ken. As a supervisor, one of the things that I picked up through the years is that a lot of the people I work with, or some of the people I work with, not all, but some, struggled with letter writing because it was something that was never taught in first trainings. And when people go certainly into private practice, they find themselves having to communicate with other professionals. And as such, they have to write letters. And I'll give you some examples of the letters that sometimes we're asked to write, or counsellors asked to write. Things like referral letters, communicating with doctors, psychiatrists, or other professionals regarding the client's mental and emotional health needs. Collaboration letters. So for those who work in schools, this could be updating social workers or other support networks about kind of relevant insights with the client's consent, because I think when we're working with children, it's worth considering that maybe a lot of other professionals involved. when working with children. It might not just be counselling, it could be social worker, there could be a legal aspect to it. And then finally, report writing. Sometimes we have to write reports maybe for legal cases, insurance claims, or even employment support. And certainly I worked with, I shared a room with a CBT therapist many years ago, and he worked for insurance companies, and he was always having to write report letters with the client's consent, and this is the key thing, discussing, effectively what length of treatment it was, how the client was doing, because some of these were then submitted for civil court cases. That he works a lot with car accidents. So when we think about letter writing, as I say, as a supervisor, I've been called in quite often to give my opinion. I've been sent letters by my supervisor. Is the tone right? Is the tone correct? Am I giving too much information away? Again, not something that's taught in first trainings, but really is not unusual for a therapist who's working privately. I mean, I've had to write report letters, Ken, and it is a very nuanced and thoughtful approach that's needed with letters, because you've got to get the tone right. You've got to communicate what's being said correctly, and any outcome from that, and what you expect from the person you're writing to. Realizing, of course, that the letter can be seen under data protection regulations by the client. Very tricky juggling act, Ken.
There's a lot to consider, and we're going to walk you through some areas that you might think about when writing that professional letter. And I'd like to kind of broaden this topic slightly, if I may, Rory, and include really professional paperwork. So sometimes when you were speaking about referrals, that you might have referral forms into referral pathways within your area. So this is paperwork or letters where it is you putting your signature at the bottom. And the thing is, when you're putting your signature at the bottom, I can't overemphasize how important that document is. So when we think of letter writing, I might think, oh, write a letter. Well, that's easy. I just write what's going on, and there you have it. But as you've already mentioned, Rory, these letters are professional documents. They may go on record. They often do go on record. That's going to be there, and it will be called upon at a later stage if needed. And like you said, Rory, there may be legal reasons to call upon the letter that is written. Certainly, you mentioned as supervisors, and we run a supervision training course in Counselling Tutor, as supervisors, you're going to be required to fill in professional paperwork, sometimes for your client, your supervisees. For example, if they're going for accreditation with their ethical body, you are going to profess and sign on the dotted line to say that this person is ready for that. I know that for our clinical supervision training course, Rory, we ask that the person wanting to do that training course present a letter from their supervisor saying that they are ready in the supervisor's eye to be able to take on that training. So they are important documents. But I want to share something that I think was the day where I realized just how important these documents are. And I'm only going to cover it briefly, but I'm sure you'll hear the gravity of what I'm speaking about. I was in a multidisciplinary meeting, so a number of different professionals from different disciplines, and they were gathered together. I was working in drugs and alcohol recovery at that time, and the individual that they were meeting about, the meeting was about taking away this person's children. So it was a very grave, heavy, emotional meeting, and certain professionals were kind of putting forward what they needed to put forward, and the outcome of this meeting was that person kept their children, and the weight that tipped it over was a letter from the counsellor that was working with this person that showed that this person was committed, was working hard, was doing what they needed to do, was arriving on time at appointments, and it was actually what tipped this hearing. And that is, think of the value of that letter. And when you're called on to write a letter, they are important documents. That's what I'm trying to really emphasize here, Rory, before we kind of go through what we might consider putting in a professional letter.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Ken. When a letter's written, we never quite know how the impact it's going to happen, the impact the letter is going to have. Or the email, it could be an email. We're talking about letters. That's kind of like a bit 20th century, isn't it? Could be an email, but usually if you're asked for professional communication, they usually want it in letter form. The other thing I was thinking about, Ken, was that if you are a supervisor, this hasn't happened to me, but it's happened to colleagues whose supervisor has gone through a disciplinary process with the ethical body or the professional body, and they've been sanctioned. What you will have to do, you will have to write to the ethical body saying that they've exercised the sanction. In other words, the sanction might be they have, off the top of my head, they may have to turn up for supervision twice a month. They might have to have extended in-depth supervision. And you might have to write to the professional body saying that they have actually attended and they have made good progress within extended supervision and have, a more nuanced approach to the difficulty that got them into trouble in the first place. So there's lots of areas of report writing, and especially things like child protection. Colleagues of mine who work in schools, they write letters all the time. They're always writing letters. I wrote a fair few when I was a school counsellor to different professionals. But, the balance is, I think, what do you share? If you're talking about a client,
Yes.
that's the crux of the matter. And I think you can't go wrong. You can't go wrong when you think about something called the Caldecott principles. Now, we've talked about the Caldecott principles many, many times, and they came into being because of a terrible incident of a child who was murdered, I think, by their uncle. And Victoria Climby was the case in point. And it turned out, as we see nowadays, to be honest, that professionals hadn't communicated to each other because they were worried about data protection. They were frightened about data protection. And what happened was, I think it was Dame Caldecott, I can't seem to remember off the top of my head, was asked to chair an inquiry. And as a consequence of that inquiry, they came out with initially, I think it was 6 principles, and then 7 principles. But there are 7 principles. And the first one, we probably won't go through all of them, but the first one is justify the purpose for using confidential information. So if you have to share confidential information to a third party about a client, what you need to do is you have to be able to justify why you've shared it. So if anybody asks you and says, well, why did you say this client has repeatedly stated that they're thinking of taking their own life? Well, the justification of that is that if you have a contract that says you'll break confidentiality if it is about harm to self or harm to others, a lot of private practitioners have that in their contracting, then you can justify it. The client understood the limits of confidentiality. They disclosed some information which went against the limits of confidentiality or collided with them, and you believe there was clear and present danger to that client, and as such, you thought that you needed to disclose that to their GP. And that's really the first position. And the handout that we've got today, the super duper handout, as Ken sometimes refers to, has the Caldecott principles. Really, really important. And another one is don't use personal confidential data unless it's absolutely necessary. And these 7 principles will be something that you'll be held accountable to should someone make a complaint about you about sharing data. So it's really important that anybody who shares data really has a solid understanding of the Caldecott principles. And I don't know if you remember, Ken, we used to teach this when we taught together. We taught the Caldecott principles, but it was never on the official curriculum. It never was, and we had to kind of lever it in somewhere because it was just so important. And I was speaking to a student not long ago, a former student who contacted me out of the blue to say hi. And she was saying that she'd used the Caldecott principles recently, and she was surprised that a lot of her peers had no clue what it was because it was never discussed in training.
Yeah, the good news is well, first of all, I just want to kind of put brackets around this and say the Caldecott principles apply in the UK. I think it's good practice no matter where you are in the world, to be honest. And if you Google Caldecott principles, you'll see the backstory, and there's quite a bit of information on it, and it's really worth knowing as a professional. And it's interesting, Rory, how you mentioned maybe it's not taught, or it wasn't during our time of tutoring taught at any great depth. It wasn't part of the curriculum. Maybe it is today. I hope it is. But I can share this with you. If you did step outside of the Caldecott principles in a letter that was later called upon and maybe a complaint was levied, you would be asked why you did what you did. And sticking to the Caldecott principles kind of protects you, but more importantly, it protects the client. And Rory's gone through number 1, justify the purpose, and number 2, don't use personal confidential data unless it is absolutely necessary. You include what is necessary, only what is necessary to get the message over. Principle 4 is accessed personal confidential data should be on a strict need-to-know basis. Principle 5, everyone with access to personal confidential data should be aware of their responsibilities. Number 6 is comply with the law. And number 7, the duty of to share information can be as important as the duty to protect patient confidentiality. That's an interesting one, Rory. Number 7, the duty to share information can be as important as the duty to protect client confidentiality. And you mentioned the case that kind of where the Caldecott principle was born, and you said horrific, and it was horrific, and there were people that held information that did not share that information, and that is why that principle 7 was put in, because had they shared that information, the tragedy could have been averted. So that's kind of some really nice principles that you can follow, and it's in the handout, as Rory said, and we'll direct you to that handout in a moment. And just one last thing I want to put in, Rory, is when you're writing a letter or you're completing a document for a client or for a supervisee, you put in it that is factual, that is factual. Not what you feel or what you surmise or what you think. Just stick to what is factual, and a very good reason for that. First of all, factual is factual, and we're able to defend it. As Rory said, justify the purpose. So if we broke confidentiality and said this person was thinking of taking their life, and we could back up that in our contract we had outlined that we would break confidentiality in the case of somebody saying that, then we have a factual basis for sharing that information. If we should ever be questioned, it's defendable decision making. But if you had to use I think that this person is blah 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 blah, and anything were to go wrong, there was a complaint, you were called before any kind of committee, you'd have a hard time explaining thinking or feeling unless there was an evidence that you could back it up. And you would try and do that in the letter yourself. You would say X, Y, and Z because of A, B, and C, and link it into a fact. And that is a good way of keeping yourself clean and not getting drawn into surmising, thinking, feeling. Rory, what else do we need to know about this?
Well, I think that with very serious letters, if you have the time, and in some cases, you know, I've written letters very, very quickly because I haven't had the luxury of being able to do some deep reflection because in some cases there was clear and present danger. It's one for supervision, isn't it? You know, if you've got the time, if you're thinking of having to write a letter and you come to your supervisor, discuss it with your supervisor because two heads are better than one. And also, you know, when we talk about Principle 7, duty to share information can be as important as a duty to protect patient confidentiality. That is the pivot of defensible decision making. That's the principle where you might have to justify yourself. And if you can evidence that you've not just thought of it yourself, but you have taken professional, a professional opinion from your supervisor. You've shared that information with your supervisor, and both of you have come to the conclusion that sharing the information is important. That actually would weigh in your favour should there be any form of investigation, because you've shown that you've taken a second opinion, and I think that's always a good thing. And I'm going to say this: I do think that there has been some some new articles in the news recently where I still think it's sharing client information to protect clients, not particularly in counselling, but in other areas of protection, especially amongst children, still not getting through. I think that sometimes we can get paralysed by data protection, and that's why it's really important for us to be very thoughtful about what information we're sharing, the importance of sharing it, and also, as I said earlier, to get that valuable second opinion to be able to kind of get you thinking in a position where you're doing the very best for your client.
Yeah. Well said, Rory. You mentioned the magic words there, data protection, and of course that comes very much into effect when you are filling in a professional document or writing a professional letter for a client, for a supervisee. If you're in the UK GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, is the law that governs how the data is captured, stored, and how it is shared. And you will be gaining informed consent right at the beginning of the journey with a client and letting them know where and how their data is stored and where it may be shared. And this is an interesting one because when we're speaking about GDPR, a in-person, face-to-face therapist who works in a room with clients, who maybe keeps their notes using written notes in a locked filing cabinet, may not have to register with the ICO, the Internet or the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, but check anyway. I'm not saying you don't. You need to check anyway for your own practice. But here's the thing. What happens when that client needs you to write them a professional letter and you open your laptop and you open MS Word or a writing thing and you write it and then you pop it in an email and you send it? You're processing data right there. So it's a tricky part. As soon as we're engaging in forms and emails and sending and writing and electronic storage, GDPR does come into effect. So always check with the ICO to make sure on that one. I know, Rory, you're on to them on a regular basis with the ICO, because in Counselling Tutor, of course, we collect and store and manage data. And Rory never guesses. He asks why defendable decision making on this date. I phoned the ICO. I spoke to this person. This is what they said. Therefore, I did this. It is documented. So there it is. Any final thoughts, Rory, before I kind of point to the handout?
Yes, don't be frightened of writing letters to professionals. You know, if it's the first time it happens to you, take supervision, take an opinion. But it is, it's absolutely not unusual at all to work as in a multidisciplinary way and work with other professionals. And where you can, I think good practice, if you write the letter on behalf of a client and the client's asked you, then I think it's good practice to show what you're going to send to the letter recipients, if you like, and before you send it, get them to agree. So you could send it on an email to the client or maybe a text, and then they could say, yes, I'm happy to send that, and then send it. And then, as always, I always say this, you then put it with your notes. Any bit of information, any client contact, you put that with your notes and store it. Because if there's any redress, they'll ask for, professional bodies will ask for your notes, communication with the client. So it's just to protect yourself. It really is. And also, I can't say any more than this, really, to make sure you're doing the very best for your client, because as we've seen in the past, professionals have been a bit wary of sharing information, and in some cases the outcome has been quite tragic.
Thank you, Rory. A really important topic. Interesting how deep we delved into it today, and that is, of course, guidance on writing letters, and you can get the super duper handout that Rory mentioned. Where do you get that? Well, you go to counsellingtutor.com. That's our mother website. Counselling with 2 L's, because we're based in the UK, and it's how we spell it. When you get to Counselling Tutor, click on podcast tab and look for episode 328. You can search it from there if you wish to, and right on that page, it's free. You can just download it. It's a guidance on writing letters. Another reference we made in this section of the podcast is we spoke about the supervision training offered by Counselling Tutor. If that's something that interests you want to train as a clinical supervisor, counsellingtutor.com, all the information is there. So that is our ethical sustainable practice for today, Rory. We're moving on into practice matters. You've already introduced Claire Ratcliffe and speaking with you on a lecture that she delivered in the CPD library on relationship therapy using the developmental model.
Yes, Claire and myself have met on many occasions at conferences and training events, so I was delighted to interview her, talking about kind of really essential information we need to consider should we decide we want to go and add couples counselling to our portfolio of offerings. And I caught up with her, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
And we welcome back Claire Ratcliffe, who's been on the podcast before to talk about couples therapy. And she's here today to share with us the lecture she produced for the Counsellor CPD Library titled Relational Therapy Using the Developmental Model. So, Claire, it's wonderful to see you again.
Oh, it's nice to see you too, Rory. Thanks for having me back.
Now, this lecture really focuses on an area of expertise that you have, which is working with couples. So is it important that someone who thinks, well, I'd like to add couples therapy to my portfolio of offerings as a therapist, is it important they do some sort of training? How important is it?
I would say it is really, really important. I know that it isn't something that that is recommended that you absolutely need to have. People do often train without having any formal couples or relationship therapy training. But I personally do feel like it is really important. I think just so that you feel even more competent and potent as a relationship therapist, because the dynamics that you're going to experience in the room, who's going to come in, what they're going to bring, their issues, their interactions together is going to be different to what you work with an individual. And there are so many choices of relationship therapy modalities out there that you will find one that you feel really works well for you, that you like more than others. So I do think not only is it really important and necessary, but there are so many options that you could that you could explore and that also enhance your overall practice. So much of the couples and relationship therapy training that I have done in different modalities has actually helped support me a lot when working with individuals as well.
Yeah, I think that's the standard thing for any training. I did a child and adolescent therapy course many years ago, and I helped. It was mightily helpful for working with adults. And in fact, there were people at the training who didn't work with children. They just wanted some sort of background. So important to train, and I guess because you're managing three processes in the therapy room: yourself and two other people, and as opposed to just two processes. So that's the thought. And I'd like to pick up on choosing the model. How important is it that you find a model maybe that speaks to you?
Well, I found for me, I trained in different modalities, and there were some that I felt didn't fully equip me with what it is that I needed. Some were helpful, but then others I found gave me more of a solid foundation to work with. And there are so many out there. You will find one that you feel you can resonate with the most, you feel that you can utilize the most. And some people will train in different approaches and then use a couple of those when working with the couple or the relationship. And it is, it's not just then that you're solidly following a particular training model or anything like that. It doesn't really work like that when you're working with couples and relationships, but just to have the knowledge and the theory and the background of what could be happening with the relationship there. And the thing is, I know that training is expensive. When you're a counsellor or psychotherapist, the training is always expensive, but we're required to have it so much. But one thing that I usually do say when I'm working with any of my supervisees who say, I'd like to look at training with couples and relationships, I'll say there's so much now that you can look at to decide which training course you'd like to go on. There are books usually for every modality. If you're looking at Imago, the developmental model, Gottman, the Terry Real therapy, all of that, any that you look at, there are books. You could read the books or you could look at articles and see any that you feel you enjoy the most, and then that might be the course for you. So there are so many ways to do that without going and spending a load of money just to find, I actually don't really like this course. Although sometimes that can give us a good idea of what we want to work with and what we don't. But there's that many books that I have on all different couples and relationship therapy that help me decide which ones to choose to go on. That usually can be a good way of doing it.
Yes, and the one we're discussing today is the Boehner and Pearson model, I think, which is a developmental approach. And one of the things that I was struck with when I looked at the lecture was that it draws quite heavily from Margaret Mailer's stages of development, which a lot of psychotherapists, and indeed counsellors, may recognise from child development models. But there seems to be a parallel. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, that is right. So when so on the slides, it will show just very briefly about Margaret Mailer's work, and then it goes on to show the work of Ellen Bader and Pete Pearson and how they kind of took that research to help expand on developing the developmental model for couples and relationships. And it's the stages that children go through in their infancy that then replicates what happens in a relationship. So the very beginnings of a relationship where you enter into symbiosis with the parent. And so when you're born and you're with the research was mainly on children and their mothers. But a child and parent, how close they are in those first few months, they are one. The child doesn't even know that they're separate. And that is what we enter into when we have a romantic relationship. The symbiosis is the first stage. Like, we're in our own little bubble. Like, oh my God, you're the best thing ever. I want to spend time with you always. I don't want to do anything else. I don't want to see anybody else. I just want us to be like together. You thinking about them all the time, messaging them, arranging to see each other. And that's the stage that you experience. And then you go into a next stage of, so usually when the child is then noticing there is a separateness, and that happens in relationships then where you enter into differentiation. Now, there are further stages, but the one that I did emphasize the most in the lecture was differentiation, because how incredibly important that is. And not all couples and relationship therapy approaches actually look so much at differentiation as what this model does. So there is that parallel process of going through the stages of where the child is growing up and where your relationship is growing up, really.
Yes, one of the things that really piqued my interest was I've visited Margaret Mailer's work through the years, and it does speak to ego development, doesn't it? I know our friends in the Gestalt world would talk about confluence, which is this idea of you don't know where you end and the other person begins. I think the best way of demonstrating confluence is a child suckling on the breast of the mother, because what happens is that you can see that the child and the mother sometimes don't know where each of them begins or ends, and this symbiosis seems to speak to the same thing. And I guess that with relationships, and I'm probably speaking for mine if I'm honest, is that it starts off like that. I mean, I've been with my wife now for 40 something. I better remember this, or I'll be in deep trouble if she has this. 45, I think it is, years. And one of the things that I've noticed through the pattern of our relationship is that we've developed as very separate people, but still retain that symbiosis. There's still a spark there that keeps us conjoined, if you like. And I guess that from reading your slides, it's about raising awareness of this, isn't it? Because the process of developing any relationship sometimes is subconscious, isn't it? Sometimes we don't consciously understand it. Am I reading that right? Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Because I have so many people who come into the therapy room who are like, we must need to break up because this is how our relationship looks. And actually what they're talking about is they're really struggling to differentiate. And they're finding it so hard that they think this is the end of the relationship, because some people finish that symbiosis phase, enter into differentiation where they realize they have different thoughts, feelings, beliefs, wants and desires to the other person. And go, oh, this means then that we can't be together. Now, there are some absolute fundamental things. If you have totally different values and actually that is going to be difficult on your relationship, then that's a little different. But to have your different thoughts, feelings and beliefs, wants, desires, it's actually it's working on how you can differentiate yourself from that other person and still remain in a relationship that's actually going to be even healthier once you work through that. And you're going to have so much growth and development. And when you've been together for years and years, sometimes I'll have people in a relationship that have been together for 30 years, but they've not gone through those stages effectively and they're still struggling. They're still stuck in different stages, and it's working with them through that. And like you said then, you've been with your wife now for 45 years. I mean, you're going to double check that so you don't get into trouble.
I am Claire.
5 years. She'll let you know. But it's then you still have that spark. You are two individuals. And this is when you go through the different stages and you come to the stage, which the final stage in it is where you experience independence and interdependence. I am my own person with my own feelings, wants and desires. And I know that you are your own person with your own thoughts, feelings, wants and desires. And we can respect that of one another, and we can be together in a loving, satisfying, fulfilling, deep, connected relationship because you have worked through having those experiences together. So you still feel that spark and connection and deep love, and you can rely on your relationship. The earlier stages are a bit tricky. We don't know it's very solid, and we're like, can we rely on this? Is it going to be okay? We disagree on this. What does that mean? And actually, when you're working through it, you come to that place where actually we can be really solid, but people struggle through it. So it isn't always easy. No.
And I guess, part of the process of going through these stages is the work of the therapist. Can you speak a little bit to how the therapist is involved with the couple in terms of maybe sharing the theory or if you like being a bit of a referee between them. How does that work?
So one of the differences with this, because again, in the training, depending on what training you have, you will be encouraged how to show up a certain way. So some of the training that I had was very much a stand back approach. You let the couple or the people in the relationship direct, and you are just there to witness and maybe step in if things get too heated. There are other ways that are very structured. That you will come in to offer different like STEM sentences and things like that for people to go off. And there are all different ways in which you'd approach it. With the developmental model, you are really encouraged as a therapist to take the lead to begin with. You are involved in the process because what you are doing is wanting to show the couple and people who are coming in the relationship, because it may be more than two people. Sometimes I'll work with a couple, or sometimes there'll be three people in that relationship, all with consent. So it's where there's ethical non-monogamy or there's polyamory. They will come here, and as the therapist, you are showing them the awareness of their interactions with one another, what is happening internally, and you are inviting them to learn something new about themselves again and again and again and again. So you are learning about your partner or partners and the relationship, but you are learning so much about yourself. And again, in this lecture, one of the things that I do put on a few of the slides there is how the therapist can step in. And one of the things that I emphasize a lot is stroke the differentiation that you see. So if you see someone in that therapy room actively trying to differentiate in some way, and that might be expressing a feeling that they have that they've really struggled to express previously, that normally they wouldn't say a word on, and showing, I noticed then that you said something that would have been really hard for you previously, but I saw you take a deep breath and express what it was that you really wanted, and it's great to see that you can do that. You're kind of then showing, I see the changes that you're making and how you're growing and developing. Or I could, so the differentiation, there are two parts to it. Self-differentiation, where you're knowing and feeling and expressing your own thoughts, feelings, wants, and desires in a way that isn't critical, blaming, or finger pointing, which is really important. And then other differentiation, where you are holding your own emotional reaction while you're hearing your partner say what they feel and what they think and what they want, again, in a way that isn't critical and blaming and finger pointing. Because that is one of the hardest parts as well, of actually being able to not take it so personally or interrupt or jump in when you hear your partner express a feeling that they have that makes you feel uncomfortable. So I do emphasize that quite a bit there, of how therapists can do that in the room. But you are kind of taking the lead because you are active in the process. And then eventually you will see it start to take on a life of its own, where they're learning the skills and they're doing it themselves. One of the things I only very, very briefly touched on verbally during the lecture was about the initiator inquirer process that comes with the developmental model. I didn't do slides on it because that in itself is a whole lecture. So I didn't go into any of it because it would have been too long, but it's a really, really great tool to work with couples and relationships and to get to know more about themselves and each other, and to explore that differentiation side of the model as well.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds absolutely fascinating and a quite unique way of working. And I wonder, when you come to look for supervision for your practice, what's your thoughts on finding a supervisor when using a model like this?
I think it's really important to have a supervisor who is a couples therapist and relationship therapist and who work a lot with couples and relationships. Some people have trained in it but do not work with couples and relationships. And I do think then it can be tricky to give supervision on that when you're not actively working in that field yourself. Because some people train it and think, no, it's not for me. I don't really want to do it. And that's usually either because they don't like it or they don't feel as confident in it. And I certainly was in the latter. When I first trained in 2013, I struggled. I didn't feel too confident, which is why I went on to do further training to then build that. Finding a supervisor, I have different supervisors for different parts of my work. And I will have supervisors who work specifically with couples and relationships as well. And same goes for when I supervise other counsellors and therapists. I have some who already have a primary supervisor who they see for their individuals, but they book me once or twice a month to work with their couples and relationship therapy side of their practice. Or if they're looking at going into couples therapy training and they want me to supervise them during that process. I think it is really important because you're going to be working through some really tough areas. There's going to be transference that comes up. There are going to be dynamics that you may not have even thought that you will face. But I do think the model that you're working with gives you something to fall back on as well. Like when it comes to the developmental model, you're looking at the stages. You're looking at what stage they are in. You can see when they come into the room. As soon as they start talking, you can see if one is still stuck in symbiosis and the other one is trying to explore the world, and there is some kind of threat in doing that. So you can see there where they are and then work appropriately with that as well. So I think supervision is incredibly important. I, like I say, have different supervisors for different things, and I offer supervision in that way. So I work with a lot of therapists who are couples therapists, and I'm also this year going to be opening up to work more with groups of therapists for supervision. So offering group supervision for people who work with couples and relationships. And that doesn't have to be with the developmental model either, because I have trained in several different modalities. I think I just love training so much, and I love doing couple and relationship training. I'm looking at doing another one perhaps later on in the year, but it has to be later. I've got so many other things to be focused on right now that I'm trying not to book onto too many things. But when I am offering that group supervision as well, that people can come regardless of what modality they've trained in, because there are so many really that there are on offer out there. But I do think supervision is just so important. It's incredibly important.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think you've highlighted a very important point, that the idea that you just have one supervisor for your work is probably one that's, I'm going to use the word a bit old-fashioned maybe, or not relevant nowadays, because if you're working in a modality or a specialist field, you may want to seek supervision out. I know that I've worked with supervisees who wanted to book me for one particular piece of specialism that I might have knowledge or practicing. And I think the other thing that's really important is that people, it's not just theoretical, it's practice based. It's they're working in it, so they can bring their, supervisor can bring their reflections from practice, not just from the academic side. I have to commend you for your dedication to CPD. It's one of the most kind of very positive things about you, Claire. Every time we meet, it's usually at a CPD conference, and you're talking about the next one you're going to book on. So it's incredibly commendable, and I guess that's what makes you the practitioner you are. That dedication to the craft. Finally, what would you hope that people took away from your lecture? What would you like people to go away with after they've watched your presentation?
I would really love if people could watch that presentation and go away learning something new that they didn't know before, or feel that they've maybe learned something about themselves in that, or that it's given them something to work with in the therapy room. I think CPD, if it gives you any of those things, it's been totally worthwhile. And it is, and thank you for saying all that, Rory. I do absolutely love training. I love it. I enjoy it. And it's something that I need to rein in sometimes, maybe. But it is, even when I was like writing that up, I was thinking of so many more things that I could have included in that. But obviously, you have a limit of the time, you have a limit on slides. I'm thinking, oh my God, there's so much there for people to know. But if anyone could take away any of those three things, that would be fantastic.
Well, relational therapy using the developmental model is available in the Counsellor CPD library now. And it just goes for me to say, Claire Ratcliffe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Massive thank you to Claire Ratcliffe. Thank you to you, Rory, as always, for holding those all-important conversations. You can listen to Claire's lecture in the CPD library. If you're a member, you can find that on counsellingtutor.com. If you're not a member, join up. Less than the price of a cup of coffee. You can get access to hundreds and hundreds of top quality CPD lectures there to sharpen your competence and your confidence with your clients and deepen practice. So moving now into student services, where we see you, the student, on your formal journey to become a counsellor, psychotherapist. And today speaking about choosing your modality of therapy. And there's a few, aren't there, Rory? Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counsellingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counsellingskillsacademy.com.
Well, there are a few. I mean, when I started, I think there were 500 different modalities of therapy. And now I read recently in a magazine that someone literally lost count because there are so many different models. It seems every week there's another model of therapy that appears. But effectively, if you're a student, if you're doing a certificate course, you're probably going to be the therapists that you're going to train in are probably going to be, certainly in the UK, and I'm talking about the UK, person-centered therapy, which a lot of colleges and universities run. You might be doing something like integrative, where you're learning about psychodynamic, which is the work of Freud, cognitive behavioral therapy, or person-centered therapy, and you kind of blend them together and use all three modes. Or you might decide you want to be a CBT therapist, or you might decide you want to go down the road of Eric Byrne and be a TA therapist. And usually TA, in my experience, is taught at private training providers. And the reason I brought this topic was because people do an introduction course, then they do a certificate. And through the certificate course, certainly in the UK, they're asked to look at three models of therapy. And one of the things I used to look out for as a tutor was how invested students were in the modalities we taught. Because if you're not invested in your modality when you go to learn it at practice level, in other words, when you're meeting clients and using that modality of therapy, it can be pretty tough if people really don't believe the therapy they're learning about is the one that they really want to practice. And I've seen this certainly in my teaching practice through the years. And it has come up recently in our Facebook page where someone has popped in a comment saying that they've kind of lost, They've kind of lost trust in their therapy and they wish they'd done a different form of therapy. And if you want to find our Facebook page, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, and you'll find us, pop in and look at the conversations. So I think if you're doing a certificate and you're looking forward to the next stage, you want to go into practice, you want to become a therapist, have a think about how well the model sits with you. And if it doesn't, and I've had students who said, I've one student, brilliant student, and she said, I don't want to do person-centered, I want to do TA. I want to be a transactional analysis psychotherapist. And I said, I think it's a good fit for you. I think it's a really good fit. And she contacted me about a year ago. She's away. She qualified a number of years ago. Really happy in practice, and they said that she made the right decision. So I think it's really important because it's a big investment, of your time. It's a big investment in terms of cost, and there's nothing worse than getting sort of halfway through your training and thinking I've got on the wrong bus, as we say in Manchester.
Yeah.
Think I've got on the wrong bus here. I think I should be on a different therapy bus.
Yes, nicely introduced, Rory. we have a library for students. It's called the Counselling Study Resource. And I'm just looking over at the different modalities that we cover in that. We've got person-centered, as you mentioned, cognitive behavioral models, which includes CBT, but also REBT, rational emotive behavioral therapy, transactional analysis. We've got loads of stuff on Gestalt therapy, on psychoanalysis. We dive deep into the different kind of schools within psychoanalysis, integrative approaches, and existential therapy even in the student library. So it's enough to make your head spin. And I was watching a TED talk of somebody speaking about outcomes in therapy. And they said, it looks so confusing, maybe from the client's perspective, when they look at all the different kinds of therapy that is available. And on the screen, it was like at the end of a film where the credits go up, but it was going very quickly. And it was literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different types, models and schools of therapy that were going past. And here's the thing, when a client is looking for therapy, sometimes they will have a preference. They will have a preference, but it is less common than somebody just looking for somebody who will be able to help them, hear them, and work with what they are bringing. And whether you work in model A or B or school C, to the client, it might not make a lot of difference in terms of how they see that modality of therapy. They see you as a healer, as a therapist, as somebody to accompany them on this journey. However, you've hit the nail on the head, Rory. This is about you and what interests you and your personality and what kind of model would fit for you. Now, I trained in person-centered, and then post my qualification looked at different areas to kind of, I guess, round that out a little bit for my practice. But I do remember looking at person-centered therapy and comparing it and contrasting it with a behavioral model and with transaction analysis. And I kind of felt that person-centered might not have been right for me at that time. This was on my certificate of counselling, so it's midway through my training. And I thought, I wonder if it really is for me, because it kind of feels a little bit touchy-feely, rather than based in a cognitive behavioral where there is science and I can tell them to do this and we've got homework that we can do, transaction analysis where it's based in they think this because of this. And when I looked at the literature, I was drawn towards TA and the more cognitive models. However, when I continued my studies, I stuck with person-centered. And it was only when I got into placement, Rory, and I saw my model in action, where I saw the results in clients and felt them within the room, that I was kind of going, wow, okay, hold on, I believe. I believe in this model now. And I learned to trust the model. And of course, Rory, you can tell us in a mo about the research, but the model is less important to the outcome of therapy, whether it will be successful or not. Now, that's not always true. There are certain presentations that will fit better with the model, but genuinely speaking, I think, Rory, you can cite the research. There is research that suggests that what is most important is the relationship between the therapist and the client.
Yes, Ken. And, we're talking about the work of Lambert, I think, and common factors. And it's been around for years. I mean, Saul Rosenwag talks about the dodo bird effect. All therapies are equal. And the research would indicate that the best outcomes for therapy for clients is where there's a good therapeutic relationship, a strong, sustainable therapeutic relationship, and motivation, and the clients are motivated. And here's the thing: it's little reported, but Rogers actually came to that conclusion. Carl Rogers came to that conclusion when he worked at Wisconsin, because he works in something called a psych project, and he worked with people with psychosis, hence the term psych. And interestingly enough, according to a guy called David Cohen, who wrote a critical biography of Rogers, it was a person-centered therapy was an unmitigated disaster with the people, the cohort of clients he worked with. However, there were some that it worked very well with. And Rogers identified that it was about motivation, they were motivated to help themselves. And I think that's really interesting. But it's two sides of the coin, isn't it? One is how the therapist feels about the modality of therapy, and is it a good fit for them? And what the client experiences in the therapy room, not really dependent on the modality of therapy. It seems like it's, two-sided, Ken.
Yes. And I guess maybe it's the reason why. If you're studying to become a counsellor, you're going to compare your main modality that is taught within your learning institution against other modalities. You're going to say what's the same, what's different, what overlaps, to kind of understand that. And I think that's done purposely, that you get a taste of different models and modalities to be able to choose what is right for you. But I also want to say, let's say you find yourself in your final year of a certain modality, going, I don't know that this was the right choice for me. And you're just about to graduate after 4 years of studying this modality. When you graduate, the road starts there, really. That's when you go into practice. That's when your clients start teaching you. And there is great opportunity to broaden what you know and how you operate, and do additional training courses. I mean, let's say you studied in a purely person-centered model, and you graduate. There's nothing stopping you from going and doing a TA 101 course and seeing how that is for you and seeing how it sits with you. Now, what you don't want to be doing is like confusing clients by mixing together a little bit of this and a little bit of that. That is what do you call it? Eclectic, Rory, when you do that. It's like making tomato soup just by taking all the raw ingredients, putting it in a bowl and saying, there you go, tomato soup. It's not tomato soup. Tomato soup is carefully blended. First the onions go in and you saute them for so long, and then you put it. So bringing together different modalities is done with care and with client match, and it comes with maturity of practice and knowing what fits right for you and what fits right for your clients. But I can certainly say that I'm no longer in practice now. I stepped away from practice when we focused really full time on counselling tutor. But I can definitely say that towards the end of my practice, I was no longer practicing from a purely person-centered modality, although that was my base modality of study, Rory.
Yes, and I think probably there'll be some people who'll stick solely to person-centered therapy, and that's fine. There'll be those who add a more informed approach. So when I practiced, I was predominantly person-centered, but with a trauma-informed approach, which meant sometimes if a client was struggling, I might share some psychological education to help them understand why they were in that situation. And I also think that generally speaking, and I'm sure there are some exceptions to this, clients are looking to be heard. I mean, this is something that comes out in a lot of research. Looking to be heard, looking to share their story. And the modality really is the instrument that you play to help them do that in different ways. So, if you are, I think if you are practicing person-centered therapy as a student and you're unsure of the modality, what I would say is, well, what's the client's outcome? Sometimes we could have a very different view of the modality we're practicing than the clients. There'll be some days that I thought I'd paraphrased brilliantly and reflected and done all the things a person-centered therapist should do and listened, and the outcome wasn't, for the client, great. There was other days where I thought I'd done absolutely nothing, and the client said, "This is the best session ever," because it lives with the client. It's the client's frame of reference. So, if you are doubting your modality, maybe speak to your supervisor first before you hop ship and trade in something else. But it is interesting, and I think for me, I read A Way of Being, and I just fell in love with person-centered therapy. And that love affair lasted a good few years until I realised there are other things that may be of service to my clients. But it's interesting. I think at certificate level, it's an interesting choice because it's a lot of money and it's a lot of time.
It is, and I with you just saying that, Rory, you fell in love with person-centered therapy. You trained as a person-centered therapy. It's your base modality, but you realized later that you could add to that you could expand your frame of reference, I guess, to your clients, and you were able to do that through doing continuing professional development. So, your base modality is just that. It's a base. It's a starting place that you go out. It's the modality that fits for you. Sometimes, and this is certainly, in my case, this was it. It was the modality that was on offer. It was the modality that was taught at the learning institution in my town. I wouldn't have known the difference between person-centered, Gestalt, cognitive behavioral at that time. All I knew at that time was that I wanted to make a difference in the world and put a hand out into the darkness to help others as I was helped when I was struggling. So the modality that I was training didn't really feature until we started comparing and contrasting. And then I went, oh, hold on a sec. There's more to this. If you're a student and you're a member of our student library, do yourself a favor. Log into your dashboard, and on the left-hand side, there's a little menu bar where you can kind of access all the lectures and this assignment exemplars and all that. Just hover over resources and have a look down there, and you'll see counselling theory. And if you click on counselling theory, you'll see all of the different theories listed there with multiple references, topics, and lectures under them. So I'm looking at person-centered right now. It's got 49 different lectures and resources just under person-centered. So go and have a look at that. If you're not a member of our student library, you can join our student library for £15 for a month. You really can. And you don't have to stay a member past that month. You can have 30 days to really look around and see what maybe is a right fit for you. And if you cancel within that 15 days, you're not going to be charged again. So it'll cost you £15, and you can access every single resource we have in the student library. And there's a multitude of resources. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of lectures on the topics that you cover in your training. That's it, really, isn't it, Rory? I mean, you started building out the library. You've now got some specialist other tutors that have come in and added to the resources you built. But basically, what is taught on at least here in the UK, we cover lectures on those topics, and it's great for pre-looking at a topic that you might be covering in university that week, or it's great for delving a little bit deeper into a topic that you've just covered that week in university, and it's best for when it's assignment time. You've got to write a case study, or you've got to do some academic writing to have an easy reference back. There's nothing nicer than having to write an essay on the 19 propositions and being able to go back and watch a lecture on it again and then write it while it's fresh in your mind. Well, there it is. That is student services. And if you're interested in the counselling study resource, our student library, Counselling Tutors, where you go to find that. And of course, You're listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, and this is episode 328. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com.
And we started with ethical, sustainable practice. We had a deep dive into professional letter writing for counsellors and looked at the importance of accuracy and thoughtfulness when you're writing professional letters, and also about maybe getting a second opinion from your supervisor before you send them, because, as we said, anything that's written down is written down. It becomes part of the statement of fact should any inquiry or you go through any form of disciplinary process. So really important you get the tone, the accuracy, and of course make sure that you share confidential information thoughtfully. In Practice Matters, we caught up with Claire Ratcliffe, who is a relational therapist with couples, and she talks about her mode using the developmental model, and there's a fantastic lecture on this in the CPD library. So if you're a member of the CPD library, you're interested maybe in couples therapy, have a look at Claire Ratcliffe's presentation, because there are a lot of different approaches to couples therapy, but she's talking about the relational therapy model, the developmental model. And then in student services, we talked about choosing your modality of therapy, making sure that the modality of therapy you're studying or choosing to practice as a student really fits with your own personal values. And finally, I'd like to thank all the people who have been sharing the podcast across places like LinkedIn or Facebook or their socials. We're really grateful of that, and also it puts the podcast to a wider audience, so they can hear what kind of myself have to say. And also thank you to all those people who left wonderful reviews on iTunes or their podcast platform of choice. So it just goes for me to say, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.